and welcome back to New Testament Explained. As always, make sure you have subscribed if you haven't already. This video again is part of a broader series of videos on Anthology 6 if you are studying Edexcel A-level religious studies. And this passage is the Pharisees investigate the healing. As I begin all of these videos, just to reiterate, what we are looking at is why does Jesus come into disagreement? What does he argue about at a topic level? Does he argue or come into disagreement about the law of Moses, Sabbath controversies, or temple cleansing? And then what we'll look at also is key themes that emerge when Jesus is in conflict. And we look at Christology, blasphemy, threat to power, and or political expedience. Now, in terms of just an overview and introduction to this passage, you should be familiar with this passage because topic 2.3, miracles and signs, has the healing of the blind man, and this carries straight on from that. Interestingly, what's notable about this passage is that Jesus doesn't feature in person, but it does continue the theme of division and conflict that Jesus is getting into can be seen through this passage, even though he is not there himself. So the confusion in the crowds about who or what Jesus is has spread to the Pharisees, who are now falling out amongst themselves about who Jesus is and his identity. So this passage is divided into 3 sections, and this part of the passage is where the topic of disagreement comes out very clearly, quite quickly. Verse 14 states, "Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath." And therefore, this is an example of Jesus coming into conflict because he has broken the Sabbath, which therefore fits the topic of Sabbath controversies. Now, the reason he has broken the Sabbath is that he has partly healed someone, but also just the making mud breaks the 39th rule of the Sabbath, which is, it says like making marks, but it can be making marks in a surface, and in order to make the mud you would make marks into a surface. So there's kind of 2 degrees, 2 ways in which he has broken the Sabbath: making the mud 1, healing the man 2nd. Moving on to the next bit highlighted, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Again, we've got this continuation and this acknowledgement from the Pharisees' point of view that this is the cause of disagreement. What's interesting, there's almost a sense of irony that the law of Moses is almost making them blind to what Jesus is able to do, that they are not seeing what Jesus is about and what his identity is. And John's Gospel does try and make the point, as seen earlier in these passages actually, that God himself did not keep the Sabbath, and therefore the Sabbath rules are man-made and therefore not that important when compared to other issues such as believing in Jesus and in God. So there we've got a continuation of Sabbath controversies causing disagreement. You could say there was also a hint of the law of Moses being the cause of disagreement, that the Sabbath is part of the law of Moses, and therefore they are too focused on that as opposed to believing in Jesus. Going on to the next slide then. Now, there is only one quote on here that is highlighted, but it's one that is quite interesting. It's quite tricky actually, so I'm going to try and take it slow and make sure you're absolutely fine with the point that is being made in this passage. So the Pharisees call the parents of the healed man into their presence, and they start questioning these parents, saying, what's happened, essentially. And in verse 20, it's not highlighted, but just to give some context, they essentially go, the man who's healed is our son. We can confirm he was blind, but we don't know who's opened his eyes. We don't know how it's happened. So they're kind of denying knowledge of how this man has been healed. And now verse 22 is highlighted because this is where the parents say that they don't reveal these details to the Pharisees because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Now, this line fits into the theme of political expedience because the Pharisees are reacting incredibly harshly, arguably over harshly, to what they consider an offence, the fact that anyone who just acknowledges Jesus is the Messiah, they are kicked out of the synagogue. So that would come under the key theme of political expedience. What we can also look at here is whether this actually happened, whether this sentence, whether this verse is historically accurate. Now, a scholar called Ellis Rivkin, he argues that the Pharisees had a live and let live attitude. And what that means is they would disagree with people, they would get into debates, often quite heated debates, but they would never persecute somebody for different views. So he makes a distinction. They'd have verbal disagreements, but it would never escalate to physical violence or persecution. So he looks at this and he's not sure that it is accurate. He doesn't think it matches up to how the Pharisees actually acted. And so what he goes and what he thinks to himself is, why does John write this if it didn't happen? And what you can look at here is the fact that when John wrote his gospel, his community were being thrown out of the synagogue for being Christian. And so what might be happening here is that whilst this didn't happen at the time of Jesus, i.e. the man who's healed, his parents wouldn't have been concerned about being thrown out of the synagogue, John adds this in to try and reach out to his own audience, to the people he lives with and in his community. So in a nutshell, this is not historically accurate. The bit in yellow didn't really happen, but the reason it is added in is so that John can reach out to his people, his contemporaries, and sort of say, I understand what you're going through, and to try and reach out to them in this way. What you can do here at this point to look even cleverer, if that is even a word, is you can make a link to topic 3.1, which is biblical criticism. Because not only does Rivkin say that this is added in order to reach out to, for John to reach out to his community, but form criticism would take the same approach. So Rivkin would be considered a form critic in this example, because form critics break Bible passages down into individual verses like we're doing here, and they try to understand why they have been written. And what a form critic would say is that this is a pericope, which is where John is trying to reflect his own audience rather than what was actually happening at the time of Jesus. Now, I've said quite a lot there. That one verse has a lot you can talk about. So I would fully, at this point, recommend pausing. If you need to kind of reverse back a bit and just rewatch this section a few times to get the different things you can say about this passage into your head, I would fully recommend it. Into the last bit of this passage then. The Pharisees hurl insults at the man who has been healed. You are this fellow's disciple, i.e. a disciple of Jesus. We are disciples of Moses. And the Pharisees are saying, being a disciple of Jesus is different to being a disciple of Moses. What is interesting here is that they evidently feel threatened. The way they are acting can be considered a reaction to the threat they are feeling. So it fits into the theme of threat to power. What you could do if you want to take this further is you could say that this sentence for John, who's writing the gospel, is quite ironic. And the reason it's ironic is Jesus is the Logos. He's the God incarnate, which means he is a part of God. He is ultimately connected to God. And what that means is that whilst Jesus comes down to earth and lives on earth for a period of time, he actually, as part of God, has existed all of the time at a spiritual level. He has always existed. And what that means is that when Jesus existed at a spiritual level and not at a human level, that if you go back in time, Moses would have followed Jesus. When the Logos speaks to Moses in the Old Testament, that was actually, in a way, Jesus speaking to Moses, and Moses listened to him. And therefore, what's ironic here is that the Pharisees are saying following Jesus is different to following Moses, but John is trying to almost get through at this point, very subtly and very ironically, that they're actually the same thing. You can't divide the followers of Jesus and the followers of Moses out, because they are ultimately together. That Moses would have followed Jesus when he was at a spiritual level before he was incarnated onto earth. Again, that's quite a complex point. Again, you may just want to watch this again and again. Leave comments below if there's any words you need clarifying, or if I teach you can drop me an email about that. Moving on then, it gets simpler from here. The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes." This is something that comes under the theme threat to power. Whilst Jesus is not threatening the Pharisees here, this is a quote said by the man who's been healed. What it is an example where the consequence of Jesus doing something, in this case healing on the Sabbath, it leads to other people starting to threaten the power of the Pharisees. So not only is Jesus threatening the power of the Pharisees in how he is acting, but consequently other people are now starting to challenge them. And this is an example where the man who's been healed verbally challenges the Pharisees, says it almost sarcastically, "Now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes." And so again, whilst it's not Jesus threatening the Pharisees, it is demonstrating that how Jesus is acting and what he is doing is making more people challenge the Pharisees' power, which is a threat. Into the final line, the Pharisees replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. So this is an example, again, it just reflects the fact that the Pharisees are being threatened, the way they react very angrily. Them throwing them out can be seen again as political expedience. It's kind of come out a second time in this passage now, that they are acting very harshly to any perceived threat. They are acting more harshly than they need to. And again, Rifkin would probably argue that the Pharisees didn't act this way, that it was all about the verbal disagreements and it was okay to have those verbal disagreements. But what John is indicating here is a key theme of political expedience, that when the Pharisees feel threatened, they are acting very, very harshly to that. That then is the end of the analysis of Pharisees investigate the healing. So it's all about Jesus having healed somebody, and this passage is the aftermath where the Pharisees are questioning the man who's been healed, his parents, to try and clarify what has exactly happened. So the topic of disagreement is Sabbath controversy. It's an issue to do with Jesus breaking the Sabbath. And in terms of key themes, a lot appear across this passage, but I'd say the key ones that come out are political expediency and threat to power. We don't get as much sense of Christology and blasphemy because Jesus is not in this passage as almost a character, as an individual. So the key themes tend to be more focused on threat to power and political expediency. Thank you for watching, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't already.